13 Reasons Why is a show about teen suicide, and one of the concerns that a lot of people have is, does exposure to images or shows lead to increased suicide? And for kids that are vulnerable, giving them exposure to detailed methods can lead to increased suicidality. Now, if a person isn't already contemplating suicide, they're able to watch a lot of the programs in the media and find it educational or informative, but it doesn't necessarily lead to suicide, unless the person already had suicidal ideas. We find that after celebrities die by suicide, there is an increase in suicide in the years following. We saw that with Robin Williams' death. In the years following, there was a 10% increase in suicide, particularly in men under the age of 45. And this is really important to remember, is that we don't want to glorify. My concern as a psychiatrist is, on one hand, wanting to be able to talk about suicide in a healthy, educational, informative manner, but we don't want this to lead to suicide. Teen suicide is a public health problem. It is the second leading cause of death in individuals from age 10 to 24. And worldwide, we see that 800,000 people annually are dying from suicide. Some of the common signs of teen suicide are symptoms of depression, which are somebody is sleeping too much, the grooming isn't there, the person is avoiding and withdrawing from society, their grades are slipping, they're using more substances, and they're engaging in more impulsive or risky behaviors. Some of the common myths of teen suicide are talking about suicide doesn't actually lead to suicide. People say we don't want to ask somebody about suicidal thoughts because we don't want to plant ideas in them, or they may think that it's just for attention, or that a person isn't going to actually do it. And what's so dangerous about these myths is that suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. People don't realize that there are so many treatments available. When you ask somebody about suicide, you are not planting ideas in their mind at all. You are actually giving them an opportunity to express how they're feeling and to actually reduce their anxiety. People who are suicidal don't actually want to kill themselves as much as they want the pain and suffering to end. And that's a really important point for people to remember, that pain and suffering as a person experiences with depression is actually treatable. And vast majority of people, in fact, 2/3 of people, will do better with treatment, a combination of therapy and medication. So many parents are afraid to get their kids the help that they need because they're afraid of stigma. What would it mean if my child was seeing a psychiatrist? And you don't realize that you are doing your family the greatest disservice by not addressing issues of suicide, depression, and anxiety from an early stage. We also need to realize, because suicide is a public health crisis, we as a community have a responsibility to look out for one another. It's not just the parents' responsibility. It's peers, it's teachers, it's counselors. Everybody needs to be on board when it comes to adolescent mental health.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.